Hello, my name is Andy May. I am a high school student at Dougherty Valley High School, and today I'm going to be presenting a research paper on how does language influence our minds from a linguistics perspective. So today we're going to be starting off this discussion with a quick example showing you how linguistic relativity specifically works and an example where it can be applied. In this case, we're going to be talking about color perception. So with the basic classical belief of linguistic relativity and the most commonly accepted term and theory that we use in this field, we would use the Sapir-Whorf theory, and that would contend that a person is only able to identify these different shades, as we can see on the left side here, with these different shades of the color green, that a person would only be able to identify each individual shade as the color green because they know the categorical term and the linguistic term called green. Without that term, the Sapir-Whorf theory would argue that they would not be able to identify these specific colors as the same thing. And instead, for example, with the top color, we would say that it's specifically light green, and the bottom color would be specifically dark green, and they would not be able to be identified as the same thing. Alternative theories also exist, which would also contend a different perspective from the Sapir-Whorf theory. In fact, when this was actually studied in an actual experiment, the Regier and Kay found that there was only partial correlation between the languages that the participants of the experiment used and their ability to identify the different shades of green as the same color and the same banner of the word green. As such, we can, from this field of color perception, we can see that linguistic relativity, although there is some evidence that it can be useful and it can show a correlation between perception and language, there is still much more to be identified. So with that said, let's begin with a simple definition of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is the most common and most widely accepted theory or hypothesis within linguistic relativity. So it was first proposed by linguists Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Warf, and it is now the most widely accepted theory of neurolinguistics. And it basically just says that language influences cognition and perception, meaning that the languages that each person speaks influences how they perceive the world, both on a level of taking in or on the level of understanding the information that each person takes in. We can divide the hypothesis even further into two distinct parts or tiers, with the lower tier being that everyone experiences the same basic level of perception, which some linguists call a rock bottom of universal consciousness. This is effectively just like the senses and the information that we take in. And then there's also an upper tier, which is the linguistic nuances that come from the different languages that different people speak, which end up creating differences within our perception based off of the information that we take in. And then if we look to the right here, we can look at the examples with English and Shawnee. With English, we have well-defined terms of clean, with, and ramrod. And these different words allow us to simply understand what it's like to clean a gun, for example, with a ramrod. While in Shawnee, they use multiple different terms which are more suited to their lifestyle, which causes them to have a different perception of how we clean a gun. Looking specifically at the diagrams here, they obviously look much different than the English ones. But then going off of that, we can look at a couple of examples where the Sapir-Whorf theory and linguistic relativity as a whole is applicable to other fields. In this case, it's the theory of mind, which is a psychological term where children are able to understand that other people have different beliefs than themselves. And with specifically the application of language and linguistic relativity in this example, we have seen that research has shown that there is an influential yet moderate effect of language on the theory of mind, which means that although there is some influence of how different languages can shape the development of the theory of mind within children, there is only a moderate effect in this case. And also, if we look at neurological evidence, which has specifically been found through like experiments using brain imaging tests and different case studies of patients that have had difficulty understanding or expressing speech, we have actually found that there is a positive correlation between the linguistic complexities, like between language and if we use specific languages, we've actually found that there is benefits to theory of mind development and better ways or more complex ways to express language in these patients. And then on top of that, we have also seen, on top of like the applications of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, we have also seen multiple challenges to them. In this case, we'll only be talking about two from Leonard Bloomfield and Noam Chomsky. With Leonard Bloomfield, it was found that his beliefs in behaviorism caused him to be more rigid, which led him to like limit the scope of linguistic relativity and limit the amount of research that was going on with how deep he could go, because with behaviorism, he only looked at the top level and only on the surface level, meaning that there wasn't much research going into what was going on with like the linguistic and neurolinguistics levels of like the studies. And then on top of that, there have also been Noam Chomsky's additions to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, specifically with universal grammar, which is a large part of the lower tier that I discussed on the second slide, where we talked about how everyone has a universal base of consciousness, which everyone experienced. Chomsky basically said that there is a universal grammar, which means that everyone has like the basic human experience, meaning that linguistic differences and differences within languages don't actually create major like differences between our perception. And then next, we also have seen multiple emerging new theories on which have opposed the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. In this case, we're going to be talking about the language of thought hypothesis and the representational theory of thought. So first, the language of thought hypothesis basically poses the idea of mentalese, which is a like mental language where we are able to first take a concept. For example, like if we were to take the concept of a car, we would need to first visualize the idea of like a metal like box on wheels that can move around. And then we would use the term car in order to like better visualize that before we can actually like say the word out loud or make the idea into a reality. And then with the representational theory of thought, it's very similar to the language of thought hypothesis, but also slightly different. And one of the main proponents behind it was the American philosopher and linguist Jerry Fodor, who posed a connection between like mental thought and the words that we put out using like computational terms. He basically said that we need mental computations and representations of certain concepts in order to put them into words and basically turn them into reality. But next, we can actually take all of the stuff we've just talked about and merge them together by comparing these different perspectives. What we really need to talk about is how all of these like different theories came from the original basic idea saying that saying that there is some link between the foundation of ideas, complexities within languages, and then the expression of such ideas as we've seen with the language of thought hypothesis and the representation of thought and the Sapir-Whorf theory. But on top of that, we've also seen that it could be very difficult to find like empirical support for these topics since it's so nebulous and it's difficult to examine linguistic determinism since we can't really get into the thoughts of others. But there has been some empirical data, specifically with the Sapir-Whorf theory, that has shown a certain level of connection, as we saw through Ray and Kejir's studies. But on top of that, or actually now we come to the conclusion of this topic, where we've seen that the current knowledge only shows that there is a limited level of linguistic determinism through the Sapir-Whorf theory, like through the evidence that we've collected so far. And future investigation on this topic should definitely be concerning the emerging theories like the language of thought hypothesis, since there's much to be talked about on this topic. And further research could possibly discuss whether or not there is like neurological activity when thoughts are being formed in order to connect a concept to a phrase, as we talked about with mentalese, if there are actually mental terms being made within the mind in order to better understand a concept and turn it into reality. But that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.